Some chains aren't forged of iron. They are the laughs of those who call you less than human. The dusty street of the frontier town swirled with heat and judgment. Sunlight reflected harshly off the worn wooden buildings, glinting in the eyes of a crowd that had gathered like vultures around a spectacle. She stood in the middle of it all, clutching the few belongings she owned, an old satchel, a ragged shawl, the remnants of a life that felt already stolen. Her father leaned against the post of the general store, hand tight around a bottle of whiskey. His eyes avoided hers, cold and indifferent. The words he had exchanged with the buyer earlier still stung in her ears. "She's yours for the price of a bottle." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Children pointed, women whispered behind cupped hands, and men smirked as if this was a transaction of the most natural kind. The heat of humiliation burned her cheeks hotter than the summer sun. She lowered her gaze, wishing she could vanish into the dust beneath her feet. "Move!" The buyer barked, and she obeyed, dragging her feet along the wooden boards of the street, the weight of betrayal heavier than her satchel. She could hear the whispers, the cruel nicknames, the snickers punctuated with elbow nudges. Lazy, useless, monster. Each syllable pressed into her bones, leaving invisible bruises that a day's labor could never heal. A coach waited at the edge of town, its wheels creaking against the cobblestones. She stepped toward it, each motion robotic, numbed by the shock of being treated as property rather than a human being. She paused, fingers tightening around the strap of her bag, and dared a glance up. Across the street, partially hidden by the shadow of a building, a cowboy watched. His face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes lingered on her with a light that was foreign to her, a look that promised something she hadn't dared imagine, hope. The train whistle blew in the distance, shrill and insistent, as if marking the moment the world had abandoned her. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her trembling hands. "I am not nothing," she whispered to herself, though the sound barely reached beyond her lips. The buyer approached, hands rough, voice rougher. "Get in, time's wasted." She stepped forward, knees stiff, the crowd parting reluctantly, leaving her exposed, fragile, and unwanted. Dust rose around her boots, curling like ghostly fingers reaching for comfort she would not find here. Her father's shadow fell across her path. He did not touch her. He did not speak. Only the cold glance, the silent dismissal of a man who had chosen whiskey over his own blood, followed her to the coach. And then, as the crowd's laughter faded behind her, she climbed aboard. The door slammed shut, echoing through her chest like the finality of her world being traded. Outside, the town continued on, indifferent, unaware that a girl had been sold, and inside, she was already learning the first lesson of her exile. The world did not owe her kindness. The coach jolted along the rutted road, each bump and jolt sending her heart into her throat. Dust clung to the windows, hazing the outside world into a blur of sun, baked plains and empty sky. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching townspeople shrink into specks of judgment, their laughter still echoing in her mind. Her fingers fumbled with the strap of her bag, tracing the frayed edges as if it could anchor her to something real, something safe. Nothing here felt safe. Nothing here felt hers. The betrayal lingered like a shadow she could not shake. "Father, how could you?" she whispered to the empty seat across from her, her voice breaking into the hum of the coach's wheels. No answer came, only the echo of her own disbelief. The bottle of whiskey had won. She had lost. She closed her eyes, imagining a place where her size, her mistakes, her very existence would not be mocked or traded like a commodity. The vision was fleeting, slipping away with the rocking of the carriage, but it carried a spark she refused to snuff out. Somewhere down the road, the cowboy from the town appeared again, standing tall on the edge of the dusty street, gold coins clutched in his hand. He had not forgotten her. He had not dismissed her as the town had. Something in his eyes, quiet, resolute, spoke of a promise that not all men were cruel, not all hands were ready to sell you for a drink. The coach lurched, dust rising around his boots, and for a moment their eyes met. Recognition passed between them, fragile but undeniable. She swallowed a lump in her throat, unsure if hope could exist after betrayal. Hours passed as the coach carried her farther from the only home she had ever known, the plains stretching endlessly beyond the windows. The wind hissed through the cracks of the wooden panels, whispering secrets of freedom, but freedom felt alien, like a word borrowed from a language she no longer remembered. She hugged her bag to her chest, the weight of her few possessions grounding her in a world that had shown her no mercy. And yet, in the quiet rattle of wheels and the distant howl of coyotes across the plains, a tiny ember glowed. A thought, almost forbidden, that maybe, just maybe, she could survive this. Maybe she could matter. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple, the coach rattled to a stop at the edge of a small frontier station. She climbed down slowly, legs unsteady, heart still raw from humiliation. The cowboy stepped forward, offering a hand that was steady, solid, unwavering. "Come with me," he said simply, no judgment, no pity, just the quiet assurance of safety, of a chance she had never known. Her eyes widened, unsure if she could trust it. But the harsh laughter of the town, the sting of betrayal, it all burned so brightly, she realized she had nothing left to lose. With trembling hands, she took his offered hand, and for the first time in her life, she felt the barest hint of a future that might not be defined by cruelty, a path that might lead to something better. The wind swept across the open plains as they walked, carrying dust and possibility alike. Behind her, the town faded into memory. Ahead, a new chapter waited, uncertain but alive with hope. Sometimes the road away from cruelty is not paved with comfort, but with the uncertainty of what comes next. The train rattled along the endless plains, each jolt carrying her farther from the town that had traded her for whiskey, farther from the father who had abandoned her. Dust clung to her sleeves, and the rocking of the carriage made her stomach churn, but she held her bag tightly, refusing to let go. She pressed her forehead against the window, watching the world smear into streaks of gold and green. Her mind replayed the town's laughter, the sneers, the pointing fingers. She had thought the world was cruel before, but she had never felt its weight pressed so directly against her chest. The sting of betrayal had cut deeper than any insult, leaving a hollow ache that made every breath uncertain. A shadow passed along the edge of the tracks, and her heart skipped. The cowboy. He had paid gold to release her from the saloon's cruel hands, had spoken no word of pity, only a promise of safety. Her hands shook slightly as she recalled the firmness of his grip, the steadiness of his gaze. Safety was foreign, almost frightening, and yet, a small part of her longed to believe it. The train hissed along, cutting through the fields of waving grass. She watched the plains blur together, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine something different. A life where she was seen not as a burden, not as a mistake, but as someone who mattered. It felt impossible, fleeting, like smoke slipping through fingers. When the train finally stopped, the cowboy was waiting. His horse pawed at the ground, restless, but his eyes never wavered from hers. Gold coins had changed hands, freeing her from the immediate cruelty of the saloon, but the gesture carried a weight she could not yet measure. It was more than money, it was recognition of worth, the kind she had never known. She stepped down from the carriage, legs unsteady, clutching her bag as if it could anchor her to reality. The cowboy extended a hand, steady and firm. "Come with me," he said again, his voice calm, certain. She hesitated, uncertainty twisting in her chest. Kindness without strings had always been a foreign concept. But the world she had known, laughter, mockery, the betrayal of her own father, was behind her now. She could not return. With a tentative step, she accepted his hand. The sun hung low over the plains, painting their shadows long and thin across the dry earth. Every footstep forward felt like both liberation and fear, the line between them so delicate she could barely trust her own courage. The ranch appeared in the distance, sprawling and unfamiliar. Fields stretched wide, livestock dotted the pastures, and a house with weathered wood and wide porches promised shelter unlike any she had known. The wind carried the scent of earth and hay, rich and alive, whispering of work to be done and lessons to be learned. She followed him across the fields, eyes wide, taking in the rhythm of this new world. Every movement of the animals, every rustle of the trees, every creak of fence posts seemed to carry a language she had never spoken, a language of endurance and quiet strength. Her fingers brushed against the fence as they passed, tracing the worn wood. Perhaps there is a place for me here, she thought, holding the fragile ember of hope against the chill of doubt. The cowboy watched her, expression unreadable, but something in the way his gaze lingered hinted at cautious approval. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of trust, the faint suggestion that she could belong, even here, even now. The sun hung low over the ranch, casting long shadows across the fields, turning the earth to bronze and gold. She followed the cowboy across the open land, each step tentative, her boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. The smell of hay, warm and earthy, filled her senses, mingling with the faint scent of livestock and wildflowers. The house loomed ahead, large, solid, unfamiliar. Its weathered boards carried the whispers of generations, and the wide porch seemed to invite her in, though she was not yet sure she deserved the welcome. She clutched her bag to her chest, its worn strap pressing into her palms, grounding her against the swirl of emotions. Fear, hope, disbelief, relief. Welcome, he said simply, his voice steady. No ceremony, no pity, just a quiet assertion of safety. She stepped onto the porch, eyes sweeping over the rooms she had never entered before. Each creak of the floorboards under her weight sounded louder than it should, a reminder that she was both intruder and guest. She felt the weight of her own uncertainty pressing down, but she straightened her back and breathed, trying to anchor herself in the moment. The cowboy showed her the kitchen, the storeroom, the barn beyond the house. Each place was alive, humming with the rhythm of daily life. She felt small, awkward, but also strangely captivated. The animals watched her approach, their eyes curious, unjudging. She reached out to stroke a horse's nose, feeling warmth in its breath and strength in its muscles, and allowed herself the briefest flicker of belonging. "Here you'll work," he said, not harshly, not commanding, but matter-of-factly. "Feed the animals, tend the house, learn the land. You'll be safe, but safety is earned." Her lips parted, unsure what to say. She had never been offered safety with conditions she could meet, conditions of effort, not obedience to cruelty. She nodded slowly, voice barely above a whisper. I understand." He gave her no more words, only a nod of acknowledgement. She felt both relief and weight pressing on her chest, the weight of expectation, the weight of proving she could belong. She wandered through the open fields, touching the grass, inhaling the sharp scent of earth and freedom. A breeze lifted her hair, brushing her face, carrying the distant call of birds settling into their evening nests. She felt the strange thrill of curiosity about the land, about the people, about herself. Could she grow here? Could she endure without breaking? Night fell softly over the ranch, the sky bruised with the first stars. She stood by the barn, listening to the quiet sounds of animals and the faint crackle of a distant fire. For the first time in her life, she felt that perhaps her past, her humiliation, her betrayal, might not define her entirely. The cowboy appeared beside her, silent, watching the field stretch into darkness. He said nothing, but she understood. This was not a place of instant trust, but of potential. And for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. Perhaps, she whispered into the evening, perhaps there is a place for me here. If I can only endure long enough to find it. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of hay and rain, brushing against her skin like a promise. She inhaled deeply, the first spark of courage flickering in her chest, fragile but real. Some houses are built of wood and stone, some are built of silence, and some are where you discover the strength to stand again. The morning air smelled of hay and dew, sharp and fresh against her lungs. She moved through the yard, carrying buckets of water, her hands rough and calloused from the work already begun. The barn stood behind her, its open doors revealing shadows of straw and the low murmur of animals settling into the day. Her steps were cautious, deliberate. She had learned in towns and streets that every motion could be mocked, every glance twisted into ridicule. Here, on this ranch, there was no one to laugh at her, not yet, at least, only the steady rhythm of work and the quiet judgment of the land itself. The children watched her from the corners of the porch, curiosity flickering behind wary eyes. One small boy edged closer, unsure if she belonged. You really do all that?" he asked quietly, as though speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile respect he sensed in her movements. She paused, fingers wet with water, and offered the faintest nod. "Yes," she whispered, her voice almost swallowed by the wind. The cowboy emerged from the doorway, boots crunching softly on the gravel. "Take your time," he said, voice low and calm, the kind that did not demand obedience but invited attention. She flinched, startled by the gentleness. It was foreign, almost frightening. She returned to her chores, sweeping floors and carrying feed to the animals. Each task burned in her muscles, each drop of sweat a reminder that effort here was not punishment, but acknowledgement. Slowly, she felt herself tethered to this place, the first invisible threads of belonging weaving around her heart. She paused by a puddle in the barn, tracing her reflection with a trembling fingertip. Her face, streaked with dirt and sweat, looked unfamiliar yet alive. She breathed, listening to the low rustle of the animals and the distant wind through the trees. Perhaps, she thought, perhaps I can be more than what they said I was. The rhythm of the ranch became a silent teacher. She learned the cadence of feeding the animals, the weight of water buckets, the sound of fences needing repair. The days blurred, and she began to understand a language unspoken, the quiet respect between worker and land, the dignity in labor done well. Afternoon sunlight spilled through the barn windows, golden and forgiving. She leaned against a post, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and allowed herself a moment of stillness. The wind stirred the hay, carrying the sense of earth and freedom. For the first time in weeks, she imagined herself not as a burden, but as someone capable, someone who mattered. The cowboy watched from the doorway, expression unreadable but eyes steady. A small nod passed between them, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the weight of acknowledgement. She felt it deep in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with recognition. As the sun began its slow descent, she returned to the barn, arranging feed, smoothing straw, tending the animals with care. Each motion was a declaration, unspoken yet undeniable. She was here, she belonged, and she would endure. The children lingered nearby, hesitant but watching, curiosity mingling with tentative respect. She caught their eyes and offered the briefest of smiles, a silent promise that perhaps, over time, she would be someone they could trust. Evening approached soft and quiet, and she paused to listen to the rhythm of the ranch. The distant lowing of cows, the shuffle of hooves, the whisper of the wind through the fences. For the first time, the silence felt like an embrace rather than an accusation. Perhaps, she breathed into the fading light, perhaps this silent house can become my home. Twilight draped over the ranch, soft and quiet, painting the fields in bruised purples and muted gold. She carried firewood to the porch, each step slow, deliberate, the weight grounding her in the rhythm of the day. The animals had been fed, the barn swept, the chores completed. Exhaustion lingered in her muscles, but a small sense of accomplishment hummed beneath the fatigue. The youngest child approached her hesitantly, clutching a small, crusted piece of bread. For helping, the child whispered, voice barely audible. She stopped, chest tight, and knelt to accept it. "Thank you," she said, voice trembling, raw with a gratitude she had never voiced before. The child's gaze lingered, fragile trust forming in the quiet exchange. She realized then that belonging was not demanded. It was given, slowly, cautiously, like seeds taking root in hard soil. The evening deepened, and she wandered to the edge of the barn, leaning against a wooden post. The air smelled of hay and damp earth, soft with the promise of night. A distant wolf howled across the plains, a lone sound that carried no threat, only acknowledgement. Her hands, calloused and raw, rested on her lap, and she let herself breathe fully, for the first time in weeks without fear of scorn or ridicule. Perhaps there is a place for me here," she whispered, letting the thought linger, fragile and untested. The cowboy appeared at the porch's edge, lantern in hand, casting long shadows across the yard. He did not speak, only nodded, a simple gesture heavy with meaning. She returned his nod with a small, tentative smile. No words were needed. In the quiet between them, understanding passed silently. Recognition, respect, the first hints of trust. She turned her gaze to the night sky, stars pricking through the darkness like distant promises. Somewhere deep in the house, the creak of a floorboard or the soft shuffle of a blanket reminded her that she was not alone. For the first time, she felt the faintest pulse of safety, fragile yet undeniable. The wind stirred the loose strands of her hair, brushing her cheeks, carrying the scent of hay and earth, of life beyond the cruelty she had known. She closed her eyes and breathed in the night, letting the ranch's quiet rhythm seep into her bones. "I can endure, I can belong, I can be more," she thought, the words a whispered vow to herself. Night settled fully over the land, and the house, silent and watchful, seemed to embrace her presence. Somewhere within the quiet walls, a seed of trust had been planted, ready to grow slowly through days of labor, quiet observation, and small gestures of acknowledgement. The cowboy remained on the porch, a silent sentinel, and she felt the warmth of his attention. Not pity, not ownership, but recognition. It was a new feeling, tender and uncertain, but it promised something she had long thought impossible: hope. Sometimes hearts are softened not by grand gestures, but by the quiet moments that remind us we are seen. The morning sunlight spilled over the ranch, gentle and golden, brushing the fields with warmth. She moved through the kitchen, stirring a pot of porridge, the wooden spoon smooth in her hands. The smell of oats mingled with fresh bread, and the simple act of cooking felt like the first thread of normalcy weaving through her life. The children peeked around the doorway, their faces curious, their hesitance softened by the promise of something new. "Can I help?" one whispered, small hands reaching toward the bowl. She smiled, the first genuine smile in weeks, and handed the spoon to him. "Careful," she said gently, voice soft and patient. "Here like this." The cowboy appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame, silent and steady. He watched the exchange, eyes calm, expression unreadable but observant. There was no demand, no judgment, only acknowledgement, and in that, she felt a flicker of pride, fragile but real. The day moved slowly, measured in small acts, feeding the animals, mending torn clothes, carrying water from the well. Each task was a ritual, and each ritual became a thread connecting her to the rhythm of the house. She found herself laughing softly when a child spilled milk, or when the goat she had been feeding nudged her shoulder insistently. Her hands grew steadier, her movements more confident, and with each passing hour she felt a shift. The house was no longer merely a place to endure, it was becoming a place to belong. She caught herself humming while she worked, a melody rising unbidden, carried lightly on the morning breeze. Later, outside the barn, she knelt in the grass, repairing a fence post while the sun kissed the horizon. The cowboy approached, standing silently, watching her with a quiet curiosity. She felt his gaze, and for a moment her chest tightened, not with fear, but with the strange weight of being truly seen. "You've learned quickly," he said, voice low, measured. No praise, no demand, just observation. She looked up, cheeks flushed, hands rough with labor. I try," she replied softly, unsure if the words were sufficient. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, fleeting but meaningful. It was the first acknowledgement that her efforts mattered, that she was more than the girl the town had mocked, more than the daughter her father had sold. The children wandered into the yard again, bringing scraps of bread or bits of hay, offering them to her and the animals. She accepted them with quiet gratitude, and in their tentative gestures, she felt the stirrings of connection. The walls of the house no longer felt like barriers. They were bridges, building slowly, silently, between her and those around her. As the sun dipped lower, painting the fields in shades of amber and rose, she paused to watch the horizon. Her hands were dirty, her muscles sore, but her heart felt lighter. Small moments, shared laughter, whispered thanks, gentle guidance, were teaching her that belonging could be earned not in grand displays, but in quiet, patient acts of care. The cowboy stood nearby, leaning against the fence, the last light of day catching the edges of his silhouette. She met his eyes briefly, and in that silent exchange, something unspoken passed between them. A tentative understanding, a recognition that both were learning, adjusting, softening. Perhaps, she thought, this heart can heal, one quiet day at a time. Evening descended softly over the ranch, painting the sky in muted shades of violet and gold. She carried a basket of laundry across the yard, the scent of fresh grass and earth drifting up to mingle with the warm breeze. The children ran ahead, their laughter a gentle rhythm against the quiet hum of the settling night. She paused, watching them play, noticing how tentative trust could transform into joy. The smallest gestures, sharing a piece of bread, guiding a hand to mend torn cloth, had begun to weave invisible bonds, and she felt herself becoming part of this fragile tapestry. The cowboy approached from the porch, carrying a lantern. Its warm glow spilled across the yard, illuminating her dirt, streaked cheeks, the calluses on her hands, and the quiet determination in her eyes. "You've done well today," he said, voice low and calm, but carrying weight. Not praise, not command, just recognition. She looked up, startled, then nodded softly. I try," she replied, unsure if her words were enough to convey what she felt inside. He smiled faintly, a subtle curve that held approval, patience, and something more she could not name. And in that moment, she realized she was beginning to matter, not as someone's burden, not as an object of pity, but as a presence that could be acknowledged and respected. Later, under the stars, she helped the children arrange their small beds near the hearth. Their sleepy eyes lingered on her, hesitant but curious, and she found herself humming a quiet tune, a melody that had no words, only warmth. The house, silent for so long, now felt alive with tentative laughter, whispered thanks, and the rhythm of shared care. She stepped outside for a moment, inhaling the cool night air, the scent of grass and distant leavestock filling her lungs. Somewhere in the darkness, the cowboy tended a lantern, watching the fields. She felt his gaze, steady and unyielding, and something in it struck a chord deep within her. A quiet warmth settled over her chest, fragile yet insistent. She thought of the town that had mocked her, of the father who had traded her, and she realized the difference between cruelty and kindness could be as subtle as a glance, or as firm as a hand extended without expectation. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of the coming night. She allowed herself a small smile, feeling the first threads of belonging, of trust, weaving quietly around her heart. The soft glow from the house's windows reflected in her eyes, and for the first time she allowed herself to imagine a future where she was seen not as less, but as enough. Perhaps, she thought, hearts can be mended, not all at once, but piece by piece, with patience, care, and a little kindness. The night deepened. Somewhere inside the house, soft breathing marked the presence of those she had begun to call her own. She stood for a moment longer, letting the quiet settle into her bones, and understood that hope was not a fleeting thing. It was a small, growing fire, nurtured by trust and small, patient acts of love. Sometimes the fiercest storms are not outside, but within, and it is courage that turns the tide. The sky darkened suddenly over the ranch, clouds swelling and roiling like a warning from the earth itself. The wind picked up, whipping the grass into furious waves, rattling the fences and tugging at the edges of the house. She paused, hands gripping a broom, heart hammering in her chest, as the first drops of rain fell, sharp and cold. The children ran from the porch, seeking shelter, small voices rising in frightened cries. She gathered them, holding them close beneath her shawl, feeling their tiny bodies tremble against her own. The storm was here, violent and immediate, but the fear in their eyes mirrored the fear in her own chest. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the fields, the animals, the wide expanse of the ranch. Thunder rolled across the plains like the sound of the world itself breaking, and she took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was no longer a place of helplessness. The barn shuddered under the wind's fury, and she ran toward it, hauling buckets of feed and water for the animals trapped inside. Each step was a battle, mud sucking at her boots, rain blurring her vision, but she pressed on, knowing that if she faltered, lives would be at stake. "Stay close," she called to the children, voice rising above the roar. "Don't leave me." The cowboy appeared suddenly beside her, boots digging into the mud, rope in hand, securing gates and doors. His presence steadied her, but it was her own courage that drove her forward. She moved from stall to stall, calming panicked horses, guiding frightened calves, shielding the youngest animals from the storm's wrath. A flash of lightning lit the barn's interior, and she caught sight of her own reflection in the wet boards. Dirt, smeared, soaked to the skin, muscles trembling, but standing not as the girl the town had mocked, but as someone who mattered, someone who could act, someone who could protect. "Good girl," a ranch hand shouted from the other side, drenched and struggling against the wind. She nodded, acknowledging the small, unspoken approval, and continued her work. Every shiver, every aching movement was a declaration. She belonged here. She was part of this land, these people. The children huddled together inside the barn, watching her with wide eyes, fear still present but tempered by awe. She smiled briefly at them, voice steady. "We'll be safe, I promise. Just stay close." The storm raged on, relentless, but with each animal secured, each child guided, each gate tied down, she felt the weight of helplessness lift. Exhaustion pressed against her, heavy and unyielding, but it was accompanied by a fierce, undeniable pride. She met the cowboy's eyes across the barn, and for a moment, lightning illuminating both their faces, Recognition passed silently between them. He had seen her courage, her determination, her strength. She was no longer merely tolerated, she was essential. The rain pelted down, soaking through her clothes, chilling her to the bone. But beneath the cold, beneath the storm, a fire burned. A fire that whispered, "I am more than what they said. I am brave, I am needed." The wind howled through the open doors, the thunder rolled across the plains, and she continued moving, acting, protecting, each moment a test, each action a declaration of her resilience. The storm showed no mercy. Rain hammered the roof, thunder shook the ground, and lightning flashed in jagged bursts across the plains. She moved through the barn like a whirlwind, guiding terrified animals, tying down loose gates, and shielding the youngest children who clung to her skirts. Her hands were raw, muscles trembling from exertion, but fear no longer ruled her. Each action, each decision was deliberate, precise. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear. It was moving forward despite it. A calf cried out, trapped beneath a fallen post. Without hesitation, she lifted it, mud and rain soaking her clothes, sweat mingling with water. The calf squirmed, but her grip was firm, unwavering. The children gasped, eyes wide, realizing that the girl they had once regarded as fragile could command strength and compassion in equal measure. The cowboy appeared at the barn door, rope in hand, shouting instructions to the ranch hands as he secured the perimeter. But he did not step between her and the danger. He had come to see her rise, and rise she did. Each motion, each act of bravery, carved her worth into the very fabric of the ranch. The storm's fury was matched only by the intensity of her focus. She guided the animals to safer pens, braced doors against the wind, and held the children close when the thunder cracked overhead. Her chest heaved, lungs burning, heart pounding, but she pressed on, refusing to falter. A moment came when she paused, drenched and exhausted, rain streaming down her face. She looked at the chaos around her, shivering animals, huddled children, the lashing wind, and felt something stir deep within. Pride, strength, recognition. She had endured what few could, and emerged not broken, but unbowed. The cowboy watched her from the doorway, eyes wide with something like awe. He had seen her courage firsthand, the unflinching resolve in her movements, the unwavering determination in her gaze. The town that had mocked her, the father who had betrayed her, none of that mattered here. She was no longer defined by their cruelty, but by the deeds that saved lives in the storm. Hours passed, the storm gradually weakening, rain softening into drizzle. Exhausted but unbroken, she stood in the barn doorway, watching the first hints of dawn pierce through the clouds. The children gathered around her, hesitant but trusting, and she knelt to brush mud from their hair, smiling despite the ache in her limbs. You were amazing," whispered one of the ranch hands, eyes reflecting disbelief and respect. She shook her head, voice steady but soft. "I just did what had to be done," but she knew it was more than that. She had faced fear, endured chaos, and protected those who depended on her. The storm had tested her, and she had emerged not only surviving but commanding respect. The cowboy stepped beside her, hand brushing hers in a silent acknowledgement. No words were spoken, but the recognition was complete. She had proven her worth, not through appearance, not through expectation, but through courage, action, and unwavering heart. The wind carried away the last echoes of the storm, leaving behind a calm, tender silence. Somewhere in that quiet, the children laughed softly, animals settled, and the ranch exhaled with relief. She too breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the storm lift from her shoulders, replaced by a quiet, fierce pride. "I am no longer invisible. I am needed. I am strong. I belong." The first light of dawn painted the fields golden. She stood tall, soaked and muddy, heart beating with the knowledge that this day had changed everything. The world had seen her strength, and she would never again be the girl dismissed by cruelty and neglect. Sometimes the world must see the truth before the heart can fully rest. The town square had never seemed smaller, nor the faces in it so sharp with expectation. She stood at the edge of the crowd, the weight of their eyes heavy upon her, some curious, some skeptical, and others outright hostile. The memory of laughter, whispers, and pointed fingers returned like a ghost, but she did not falter. Not now. The cowboy stepped beside her, a silent pillar of strength. His hand brushed hers briefly, grounding her. She inhaled deeply. The scent of earth and sun carried on the breeze, reminding her of the ranch, the life she had begun to forge, and the courage she had earned. A murmur ran through the townspeople. Why does he shelter her? Someone asked, voice edged with disbelief. Others nodded, faces twisting with judgment. She could feel their doubts, their unspoken accusations, pressing against her like stones. The cowboy's voice cut through the tension, calm, firm, and commanding attention. She is brave, loyal, true. She has saved my home, the lives of my children, and the animals in my care. Her worth is measured not by her shape, her past, or what others have said, but by her deeds. She watched as whispers faltered into silence, the town unsure how to respond. Eyes shifted, some narrowing, others widening, as the undeniable truth settled over them. A child from the ranch stepped forward, holding a hand to her chest. "She saved us," the child said, voice steady. "She helped the animals, she protected us. She's brave." Another nodded, a young ranch hand echoing the sentiment. "Everything he says is true. She faced the storm, guided the livestock, and kept the children safe. We would not be here without her courage." Her chest tightened. She had never been praised in such a way, never spoken for in the face of doubt. The weight of her past, the humiliation, the betrayal, it seemed to press against her less now, softened by the undeniable acknowledgment of her deeds. A hush fell. The town could no longer deny what had been done, could no longer twist her into the outcast they had declared her to be. The evidence was in every story, every act of bravery recounted, every voice lifted in truth. Finally, the cowboy turned to her, eyes meeting hers. "Speak," he said simply. "Tell them yourself." Her throat tightened. For the first time, she stood fully seen, and she realized that her voice carried weight. She drew in a slow breath, feeling the courage cultivated over months of labor, quiet endurance, and small acts of care. I am not who you think I am," she began, voice shaking but growing steadier with every word. "I have faced the storm, I have protected those who could not protect themselves, and I have worked to belong, not because anyone demanded it, but because I chose to. I am worthy, not because of your approval, but because I have earned it through my actions." The town remained silent, the truth settling like dust over the square. Some eyes shimmered with shame, others with newfound respect. She straightened, head high, feeling a surge of pride and clarity. "I am no longer the girl traded for whiskey. I am more. I am seen. I am heard. I am respected." A few townspeople stepped closer, nodding slowly, their expressions softening. The children's voices echoed in the square, tiny but insistent, validating every word she had spoken. For the first time, she felt the weight of justice settle, not as a distant dream, but as a lived reality. The crowd had fallen into a quiet, almost reverent hush. She stood in the center of the town square, heart-pounding but steady. Every memory of scorn, the laughter, the pointed fingers, the whispers of derision, rose and fell within her, replaced by the undeniable truth of her actions. She took a breath, letting it fill her chest. The air smelled of dust, rain from earlier storms, and the faint tang of metal and wood. She had walked through humiliation before, and she would not shrink now. Her voice, clear and unwavering, carried across the square. "I am not the girl you mocked," she said, letting each word land deliberately. "I am not defined by betrayal, by cruelty, or by the judgment of those who refuse to see. I have lived through storms, tended the helpless, protected the young, and earned my place in this world. The cowboy stepped beside her, silent support at her side. His presence was steady, grounding, but he allowed her to speak, to claim the recognition she had long been denied. The townspeople shifted, some lowering their heads, others watching her with a dawning respect. A young child, cheeks flushed and eyes bright, stepped forward. She helped me. She saved us. The child whispered, voice strong despite the tremble, "She's brave. She's one of us." Another voice rose, clear and firm. "Everything he says is true. She is loyal, courageous, and worthy, not because of who she was, but because of who she is now." Her chest swelled with a quiet pride. The town, once cruel and dismissive, now stood in the wake of undeniable truth. The whispers of mockery had been replaced with murmurs of respect, and some faces even softened into apologies unspoken but felt. She looked to the cowboy, eyes meeting his in a moment of silent acknowledgement. He did not speak. He did not need to. The quiet understanding between them was profound. She had been tested, and she had prevailed. Her worth was no longer questioned. It was evident. Tears pricked her eyes, not of shame, not of sorrow, but of relief. For the first time, the weight of rejection lifted. She had faced cruelty, endured injustice, survived storms, and now stood tall in the face of her detractors. The townspeople began to murmur again, but this time with a different tone. Respect. A few nodded slowly, some offered tentative smiles. The children, gathered near her, laughed softly, their innocence now joined to the reality of her courage. She lifted her chin, feeling the sun begin to pierce the clouds, light spilling over the square. "This is my place, not granted, not given out of pity, but earned," she thought, letting the words settle within her like stones finding their rightful place. The cowboy extended his hand, a quiet invitation, and she took it. No words were necessary. In that simple touch, all the trials, the storms, the labor, and the endurance found their acknowledgment. She belonged, truly. Somewhere in the square, a breeze lifted, rustling the banners and flags, carrying with it the faint scent of rain, soaked earth. The town exhaled as did she, and for the first time, a full sense of peace began to settle in her chest. I am seen, I am valued, I am enough. Sometimes the sun rises not just on a new day, but on a life renewed. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, spilling golden warmth across the ranch. Dew glistened on the grass, each droplet catching the fragile morning light. She stood on the porch, hands folded, watching the world wake with quiet reverence. The air smelled of earth and hay, of new beginnings, and it carried a gentle promise. This day was hers. The cowboy emerged behind her, quiet as the morning, eyes tracing the same horizon. He did not speak, but his presence spoke volumes. Steadiness, respect, admiration. She felt a small thrill of anticipation, mingled with the calm that came from knowing she had survived, endured, and been seen. Children ran across the yard, laughing and shouting, their joy ringing out like bells. Some tugged at her skirts, others waved excitedly toward the porch. She knelt to meet them, smoothing hair, laughing softly, feeling a warmth she had never known, the sense of being cherished, of belonging wholly and freely. She glanced at the cowboy, whose gaze lingered on her longer than necessary, steady and sincere. His expression held something she had never dared hope for, recognition of her worth, admiration untainted by pity, and a quiet, abiding affection. "Morning," he said, voice low, calm, familiar. "Morning," she replied, voice soft, yet carrying the confidence she had earned. The words were hers, fully hers, no longer hesitating under judgment or fear. They moved together toward the stables, helping the children tend the animals, sharing small moments of laughter and gentle guidance. Every motion, every glance, was unhurried, deliberate, filled with the comfort of familiarity and the subtle acknowledgement of mutual respect. The ranch breathed around them, alive with life and purpose. Animals stirred, gates creaked, and the wind carried the scents of hay, grass, and the lingering freshness of rain from days past. In this rhythm she felt rooted, tethered to the world not by obligation, but by love and earned belonging. She paused to look back at the house. The walls, once cold and silent, now held echoes of laughter, work, and trust. She realized, with a gentle swell in her chest, that she had found a home, not just in the walls or the land, but in the connections she had forged through courage, care, and resilience. A soft breeze carried the children's laughter across the yard, and she closed her eyes briefly, inhaling it like a benediction. The storms, the betrayal, the mockery, all of it had led to this quiet, golden moment. And in that moment, she felt the weight of the past lift completely. I have endured, I have loved, I have been seen, and now I belong. The cowboy stepped closer, offering a hand, not to command, but to share in the quiet beauty of the morning. She took it, warmth spreading between them, a promise unspoken yet fully understood. The sun rose higher, spilling warmth across the fields, turning dew into diamonds and the horizon into a canvas of gold. She stood on the porch, hands resting lightly on the railing, feeling the breeze lift her hair and brush her cheeks. The ranch was alive with the sounds of morning, birds calling, horses whinnying softly, children laughing as they chased one another across the yard. The cowboy approached, his boots soft against the wooden planks. He stopped beside her, his presence quiet but grounding. For a long moment they watched the world awaken together, no words needed, just shared understanding. Finally he spoke, voice low and steady. "You've earned more than this ranch. You've earned their hearts and mine as well." She turned to him, eyes searching his, finding nothing but sincerity and warmth. A faint smile touched her lips. "I never thought I'd be worth anything," she whispered, voice trembling, "not to anyone." "You've always been worth more than anyone could see," he said, hand brushing hers gently. "I just helped the world catch up." Silence fell between them, comfortable and full. Then he knelt suddenly, the world holding its breath, and reached into his coat. She froze, heart pounding, as he revealed a simple, worn ring. "I don't want pity. I don't want charity. I want you. By choice, by love, by respect. Will you marry me?" Her breath caught. Tears threatened, but she laughed softly, disbelief and joy mingling. "Yes," she whispered, voice shaking, then steadying. "Yes, I will." The children erupted in cheers, running toward them, lifting their arms in celebration. Even the animals seemed to sense the shift, nuzzling and whinnying in soft approval. The house behind them, once a place of labor and endurance, now held echoes of laughter, joy, and a future bright with possibility. She looked around the ranch, the fields, the barns, the wide-open sky, and felt a profound peace. Every storm, every humiliation, every lonely night had led to this. She had been forged in hardship and tempered with courage, and now, finally, the world had opened its arms to her. The cowboy took her hand, lifting it gently. "We start anew," he said softly, eyes meeting hers, together. "Yes," she replied, voice steady, heart full, together. The sun climbed higher, light spilling over the land, painting everything in warmth and gold. She laughed freely, a sound unburdened and true, and for the first time the past felt distant, powerless against the life she had earned. From betrayal to bravery, from isolation to love, this is my life, my home, my family, and I am whole. The camera of the mind pans over the ranch, the children playing, the animals settled, the fields stretching endlessly, and settles on her face, serene, radiant, finally free.